and the contemporary that is announced and that is arrived at within the sermon. It is that preaching of a practical theology that we have discussed. Now we're going to take a few minutes and we're going to discuss some methods of sermon introduction, knowing that the introduction needs to do such things as grab the attention, build interest, connect to a present context, bridge the gap. It needs to set the stage for the story, provide a preview, and it needs to resolve an issue. So how do we do this? All within the first few minutes of a sermon, and sometimes even less, depending upon the length expectations of your particular congregation or the particular setting that you'll be preaching in. We start by one use, or one method, shall we say, is the use of a factual contemporary story, meaning that you can begin your sermon, your introduction, by laying out a contemporary story, something that has recently happened, or even something that has happened in the near future, but something that the majority of the congregation will be able to follow along with or have some limited understanding of. You can't use a story that your congregation is going to have no idea what you're talking about, because then you'll lose them. But it needs to be a story that they will understand, or a story that they may have experienced, or someone close to them has experienced, and you use it to enter into a dialogue to connect it with the ancient story that you are going to use based upon your selection of the biblical text. Now, this can work very well, but there has to be one caution that's needed, that when you use this type of strategy, that the connection between a contemporary story and the ancient story, you must be very clear and sure that the stories actually are comparable, that you can't use a biblical story and try to overlay over top of a contemporary story that it just does not fit. And often that does happen, and things are misinterpreted and utilized in the wrong way. So that, again, that's a caution. Though it works well, you have to be sure that the two stories are compatible, they are comparable. And if they are not completely compatible and comparable, that you point out the differences to your congregation so they will not be led in the wrong direction. Now, the second particular method that can be utilized is that of using a hypothetical contemporary story. For example, as we started in lecture number 4, we talked about Lazarus' situation, and we could use Lazarus' story and be able to use a hypothetical contemporary story. And what I mean by hypothetical, that it may not be our story in particular, it might be true for somebody, but it's hypothetical because we're not addressing a particular person or a particular issue that, putting someone's business out there, so to say, but it's hypothetical, and it's rhetorical in a sense that you will ask the questions in a way that gets your audience thinking with you, but not giving you an actual answer. So we can, say things like, can you imagine being sick, knowing that there is one that can heal you, but the one that can heal you hasn't shown up? And the doctor has told you that you have days, maybe even hours left to live, but the one you know that is capable of fixing your situation hasn't come yet. So you can use such hypothetical stories to tie into what may Lazarus been thinking, and then move into the rest of the story, and then derive a issue or a question that arises out of that your particular sermon will address in light of a hypothetical story along with the biblical story itself. Another method is retelling the biblical story in a modern vernacular, meaning that you read the text for your congregation and then you give your linguistic interpretation of retelling the story without changing the story, but maybe changing the language of the story or contextualizing the story to place it into a modern context for your congregation. For example, the woman with the issue of blood, and being able to talk about her being an outcast, being depressed, being friendless, and possibly being hopeless, as she moved through the crowds of people that did not even recognize or want to acknowledge that she even existed. So using such language to put it in a modern vernacular or a modern way of speaking is a good way of introducing and then shifting into how this particular biblical story fits into our modern context. You can also use another method of first-person perspective of the Bible story, and that is placing yourself into the story and going through the story as if you were one of the characters within that particular story. For example, stating in the introduction that, good morning, my name is Nehemiah and I'm the cupbearer to the king. And then progressing throughout Nehemiah's story, picking up and pointing out the aspects of that story that you want to raise on a particular occasion. Another method is also intermingling of the biblical story with a contemporary situation. Again, this is one of those methods that it takes some time and experience to be able to do successfully, but it can be done. One example is if you think of the beginning of Joshua and Israel crossing the Jordan into the Promised Land, that this text can be used as a teaching on a variety of challenges that a congregation might be facing, with giving rise to factors of making such decisions based upon faith and trust and obedience and direction and so on. These are exceptional passages in the opening chapters of Joshua to be used as all of Israel was challenged to be attentive and obedient and so on. And in those particular stories that are laid out in each one of the opening chapters of Joshua, any one of them can be used in dialogue with a congregation's present or previous or soon coming situation. And you can use that in this particular method by telling part of Israel's story and then shifting to part of the congregation's story. They are at the edge of the Jordan, and before crossing over the night before, God speaks to Joshua and tells him that all of the Israel is going to be given the land of promise, and you have to be obedient to what I tell you to do and remind the people of everything that I have brought them from, and they have to be particularly obedient to every word that I'm about to tell them in order to enter into the Promised Land. And then shift to our present context is that we are now standing at the bank of the Jordan, and God has shown us the vision and the Promised Land of where we can go and what we can progress to, but we have to be obedient and attentive, and we have to move by God's orders and his commands. And then you could shift back to Joshua's story. So Joshua tells the priests to go out and stand in the water, and hopefully you get the understanding of how that particular method can work, of going back and forth between the biblical story and a contextual current situation. And again, caution has to be given that you have to do it ever so careful, and you set up phrases and words so that a congregation understands when you are shifting from the biblical narrative to a contemporary narrative and not getting caught up in the intermingling between the two. So you have to take your time, and it has to be done very particular to how you make those transitions back and forth. So we've talked about several methods of introducing the sermon: using a factual contemporary story, using a hypothetical contemporary story, retelling the biblical story in a modern vernacular, first-person perspective storytelling where you're placing yourself as a character within the Bible story, and the intermingling of the biblical story with a contemporary situation. And then finally, we want to talk about transitioning from your introduction into the body of your sermon. And the body of your sermon will be lecture number 7, which my colleague Dr. Lomax will be presenting to you next. But we want to think about how you transition from introducing to connecting into your body. And from your introduction to the body of your sermon, there are several methods that can be done. One is that you can state the thesis of your sermon. As we talked about earlier in this particular lection, that every sermon needs to have an issue that is being addressed. So whether you raise a question, whether you make it a statement, you can state that prior to moving into the body of your sermon, which lays out and points back to resolving whatever that issue that has been raised. You can also state the antithesis or the antithesis. Buttrick utilizes this heavily, where we talk about that you have a thesis and then you rearrange the wording of that thesis and turn it to an antithesis or a question that addresses the thesis. So if you say that Jesus is the Son of God, then the antithesis of that is, who is this Jesus? So that would be a thesis. The question would be the antithesis. So you can use that interplay as well as a way of transitioning from your introduction to your body. And then finally, another way of transitioning, or the most simplistic way of transitioning, is to give your congregation a preview of what you're going to talk about. Give them your thesis and saying, this is what today's sermon is going to be about, the A, B, and C, 1, 2, and 3, 4, whatever the case may be, a short summary that gives in a couple of sentences what it is your sermon is going to embody on a particular day, and then you progress into the sermon. Some final thoughts on this particular lecture. One, we must understand and must be aware of the fact that introductions are not static. Having 15 plus years in preaching experience, yes, I've preached some sermons on numerous occasions, but I have never given the same introduction twice, because introductions help set up a particular sermonic discourse for a particular audience in a place, time, and so on, with all of the other things that we've talked about, such as traditions, the story, and so on, that we have discussed in the previous lecture. Keeping all of those in mind, that introductions need to be particular to a particular congregation and a group of people. Second of all, introductions are possibly the most important aspect of a sermon. Again, I can't overemphasize the fact that if you don't grab your audience and gain their attention at the opening, you may never gain their attention. They may never hear anything that you have to say until you say that this is the end of your sermon, or you sit down. And then finally, know your audience, know your audience, know your audience. You need to know your congregation, being able to understand where they are, what their experiences have been, what is important to them, in order to be able to hear rightly, exegete correctly, frame and shape your sermon appropriately so it addresses a particular people in a particular place and time. And of course, it goes without saying that all of this should be covered in much prayer, much study, and understanding your calling and your place in God's plan. This has been lecture number 6, introducing the sermon. Thank you for your time. And as previously, if you have any questions, feedback, concerns, feel free to contact myself or Dr. Lomax at the ITC. Thank you.